aren't you amazed that in early Islam, the culture was that haya would not get in the way of men and women learning from each other? That is something that amazes me. Both genders are learning from each other. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari used to say, we would see the companions of the Prophet ﷺ gathered outside the house of Aisha radiallahu anha seeking her fatwa. The reason is because the Prophet ﷺ created spiritual equality between the genders. And our Prophet ﷺ, there was an incident that occurred in his time. Hadith comes in Al-Bazzar. Once a man was sitting in the gathering of the Prophet ﷺ, and his young son walked in. So when the young son walked in, he hugged him, kissed him on the forehead, and had his son sit on his lap. And then his young daughter walked in, and he just kind of had her come in and kind of sit on the side. And the Prophet looked at this, and you know what he said? He says, وَهَلَّا سَاوَيْتَ بَيْنَهُمَا. Why would you not give them an equal treatment? Why would you discriminate like that? So, in Islam, there's spiritual equality for sure. And my dear brothers and sisters, some scholars argue that in early Islam, especially at the time of the Prophet, women probably had more of an access to education with the Prophet than even men. They say this because whenever the Prophet is teaching them, he's teaching publicly so both men and women can attend. But then ladies went up to the Prophet, hadith comes in Bukhari, they're like, Ya Rasulullah, how come men are always surrounding you? We want that one-on-one time. We have our private questions we want to ask. So, غَلَبَنَا عَلَيْكَ الرِّجَالِ فَاجْعَلْ لَنَا يَوْمًا مِّن نَفْسِكَ. Make a day for us ladies, exclusively for us. So the Prophet made an exclusive day just for the ladies. And you guys, by the time the Prophet passed away, he left behind scholars in every field. There are women scholars in hadith and male scholars in hadith. There are women scholars in Quran and there are male scholars in Quran. To give you an idea, to give you just a small idea of the scholars the Prophet ﷺ left behind. Abu Abdullah Hakim al-Naysaburi is one of the great scholars of hadith. He says 1/4 of fiqh revolves around the narrations that come exclusively from women. And had they not narrated and taught, those hadith would be lost, and that fiqh and that part of sharia would be lost. To give you an idea of how influential female scholars were early in Islam, Darda radiallahu anha, Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, in Bidayah wa Nihaya, he writes, and Ibn Kathir used to be in Damascus. Allow me to remind you real quick, when she's alive, the capital of the Islamic world is Damascus. Because this is the time of the Umayyads. Umayyads had moved their capital to Damascus. In the heart of Damascus is the mosque known as Jami'u Dimashq. And in the heart of this mosque is the chief teaching position. And who's teaching? Darda radiallahu anha. She held that prestigious teaching position. And Ibn Kathir comments, and he says that when she would teach in the men's section. And men, top-notch scholars, jurists, would come and study with her, including the Khalifa of the time, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. They're all sitting in her gathering, learning from her. In fact, one of the students says, how many were the times I saw Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the Khalifa, how many were the times I would see him sitting in her gathering, benefiting from her, conversing with her. And you know, to go a little bit deeper into this, in her biography we're told that she would spend 6 months in Damascus, 6 months in Palestine. And I was really happy that I could do her biography today, especially in light of all the events that are unfolding overseas. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help the people of Gaza and to free the people of Gaza and people of Palestine. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. She would spend 6 months in Baytul Muqaddas and she would teach there. In one narration we're told, you know the dome of the rock itself, she would lean against a rock and she would teach from there. And once again, top scholars, students of knowledge, male and female, would attend her gathering. And she would teach from the rock, and once again, in her gathering is the Khalifa of the time, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And the narration goes on to say, when it would be time for Maghrib, and the adhan would go off, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan would walk her to the section of the ladies now, where she could pray, and he himself would walk up and lead the prayer. SubhanAllah. This is her stature. This is her status. Now you might be thinking, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he's probably a lightweight when it comes to knowledge. La. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is at the caliber of scholarship of someone like Sa'id ibn Musayyib, who is Sayyidut Tabi'in. Probably the greatest scholar from the generation of the senior Tabi'un is Sa'id ibn Musayyib. He was a son-in-law of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. At the caliber of Sa'id is our man Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. In fact, when Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu's son, Ibn Umar, when he was about to pass away, they asked him that the elders of Quraysh are about to die. Who are we going to seek ilm from after you? يُوشِكُ أَن تَفْنَدُوا. You're about to die. Who are we going to ask after you? Ibn Umar, the great Ibn Umar. He says, إِنَّ لِمَرْوَانَ إِبْنًا فَقِيهًا فَاسْأَلُوهُ. Marwan has a son who's a faqih. Go ask him. Who's he referring to? Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. You know, they say game recognized game. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he's a massive scholar in his own right. And now he is coming and spending time in the gathering of Darda radiyallahu anha. This gives you some idea of the credentials she had. Go a little deeper when it comes to her knowledge. Imam Bukhari, he brings a chapter heading in his Sahih al-Bukhari. And the chapter heading is Babu Tashahhud. How do you sit in Tashahhud? According to the Hanafi school of thought, when you're sitting in Tashahhud, the ideal posture for men is that you do something called iftirash, where basically you let your left leg kind of carpet the floor and you sit on your left heel. And your right foot is erect. And typically you and I sit that way. However, for ladies, we recommend something called tawarruk. Tawarruk is when you sit on your rear is on the floor and your legs are slightly to the side. And Hanafis, we say that this is more of a compact and more of a modest position for ladies. Imam Bukhari took the opinion that actually the sitting posture in tashahhud for ladies and for men should exactly be the same. That was his fiqhi position. They should sit exactly in the same manner, which is iftirash, which is basically the left leg you're sitting on and the right leg is erect. Now, why am I telling you all of this? One of the evidences that he brings to back up his position, he says, وَكَانَتْ أُمُّ الدَّرْدَى تَجْلِسُ فِي صَلَاتِهَا جِلْسَةَ الرَّجُلِ وَكَانَتْ فَقِيهًا. Imam Bukhari backs up his position by saying, and Darda, when she would sit in her prayer, she would sit the way men would sit, and she used to be a faqihah. So her words and her actions carry authority. To give you an idea of how influential female scholars were early in Islam, one of the great students of Aisha radiallahu anha, her name is Amra bint Abdul Rahman. She grew up in the household of Aisha radiallahu anha. And the great Imam Zuhri, who I mentioned earlier, as he's studying knowledge, one of his teachers, Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, who was one of the 7 jurists of Medina, Qasim says to Imam Zuhri, I see you obsessed with knowledge, and should I point you to a reservoir of knowledge? Imam Zuhri is like, please, of course. He's like, go to Amra, alayka bi Amra. Imam Zuhri says, I went and studied with Amra, and I found her to be an ocean without a shore. Boundless ocean of knowledge. This Amra is so influential that what happened in Medina at that time, that the judge of Medina issued a ruling against one of the slaves. Basically, the slave was caught stealing something. The case was brought to the court, evidence was established, witnesses were there, and now the punishment was about to be applied, and his hand would have been cut. Amra finds out, and she intervenes. She sends one of her students to the court, and she has the following message for the judge. She's like, tell the judge you cannot implement this punishment. Why? Because I heard from Aisha, who heard from the Prophet ﷺ, that hands are not cut unless a thief steals something of a certain value. And what this slave has stolen does not reach that value. When Amra's fatwa arrived in the court and the judge read this, he threw the case out and did not implement the punishment. You know why this is crazy? He doesn't turn around and say, I'm sorry, who's this lady again? I'm the judge here. And Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Bakr is alive. Sa'id ibn Musayyib is alive. He does not consult any of them. Amra has spoken, the case is thrown out. This is the influence of her fatwa, man. This is crazy. And they're not carrying these stereotypes and misogyny. They're like, I'm sorry, tell her to shut up and cook. La 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 la. Amra has spoken. Her name carries currency. And by the way, there are so many examples we can give from early Islam. I'll just give one more example. I know that, mashallah, you guys have heard a lot of stories today, but this is to break the stereotype that Islam somehow did not empower women, that men in Islam just oppress women. SubhanAllah, what name you want to know? Fatima bint Ibrahim ibn Mahmud al-Batayahiyya. She lived in about the 7th century of Islam. So this is roughly about 700 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Her name is important because she got to learn hadith from one of the top scholars of her time, Az-Zabidi. Now, she learned Sahih al-Bukhari directly from him. And what happened is that Zabidi was probably the greatest scholar of his time, and he has a very short chain to Imam Bukhari. Long story short, she learned Sahih al-Bukhari from him, and she went on to become a great scholar in her own right. And part of her life was that she got to do Hajj, and then she got to go to Medina. When Fatima arrives in Medina, scholars of Medina find out that Fatima is in town, the student of Az-Zabidi. And when people heard that she's in town, scholars wanted to create a gathering where they learned Sahih al-Bukhari directly from her. And then to honor her, they had her sit in no other place than in front of the grave of the Prophet ﷺ himself. She's given the honor and the station of sitting in front of the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, and she's narrating hadith, particularly the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, and she is teaching her students, male and female. And one of the times she's narrating the hadith, she would say, وَقَالَ صَاحِبُ هَذَا الْقَبْرِ, pointing to the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. And after the class was done, she would sign all the licenses and ijazat herself. This type of dignity that men and women had, that they could learn from each other without being awkward around each other. SubhanAllah, this was the culture of early Islam. Now in our day and age, things have become kind of extreme. Now, especially in Pakistan and India, you don't see women in the masjid, period. Because the reigning fatwa amongst the Hanafis in Pakistan and India is that there's no reason for ladies to come to the masjid. So even for Jum'ah masajid, basically they don't even build the ladies section anymore. Now, of course, we have reached another extreme in America where there is basically what we call the progressive mosques, when men and women are kind of standing right next to each other. So this is what they call radical equality. So, human beings, we tend to go from one extreme to another. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we achieve some sort of a middle.